So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction, where we're looking at T.S. Eliot's poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So in this particular lecture, we'll finish this poem and we'll just wind up with some of the general discussions we had on this poem and Eliot's early poetry in general. So we've seen how this poem is, among other things, a poem about procrastination. It's about this indecision, it's inhabiting an indecisive moment. To be or not to be, to go or not to go. The speaker, the male speaker in this particular poem, is obviously quite neurotic, and he cannot bring himself to go to a particular space that he wants to inhabit, he wants to have access. And that space is a social space, it's a high prestige space. It's got high prestige markers about it, and it's a space women come and go talking of Michelangelo. So again, Michelangelo becomes here a metaphor for high art. A metaphor for high culture, which is consumed by a very privileged clientele, a privileged set, a privileged group of consumers. Right? That's a space where this male speaker wants to go, but obviously he cannot bring himself to visit that place. And that the failure to visit a place, like the failure to narrate the experience, becomes part of the poetry in this particular poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And just if you remember when we ended the last lecture, we talked about how the speaker keeps saying that, there's constant references to that is not what I meant at all, that is not what I meant at all. This difference between what you mean and what you're able to say is something which is dramatized in this particular poem. That difference becomes an epistemic difference, a difference, a level of knowledge, but it also becomes a difference which is quite existential in quality. You know, as a human being, as a human subject, you know a certain knowledge, you have access to a certain knowledge, and the knowledge can be one of darkness, the knowledge can be one of enlightenment, the knowledge can be one of epiphany, etc. But you cannot bring yourself to tell the knowledge, to convey that knowledge. And this failure to convey, this failure to narrate becomes a very big part of the narrative politics in this particular poem. Now, those of you who have read Renaissance theatre would know that one of the most famous literary examples of this procrastination, of this indecision, is Shakespeare's Hamlet. And now, interestingly, Hamlet is brought in this particular poem as well as an intertextual reference. So what is intertextual reference? An intertextual reference, or intertextuality, is a process through which one particular text, a fictional text, refers to another text in order to convey a point, to corroborate a point, to emphasize a certain point. Now that reference to another text is like a hyperlink condition. That reference to another text becomes part of the narrative politics of this particular text. So let's say if text A is mentioning text B as some kind of a reference in terms of the content that text A carries, then that process through which that reference is made, that becomes a part of the narrative politics of text A, right? So you see that in films as well. Let's say, for instance, you can have a film which has a particular scene in which the characters in that scene refer to some other film where there was presumably a similar situation or a different situation. Now what that does is that it makes the connect interesting, and at the same time it emphasizes the point either as a comparison or as a contrast. Now there is an intertextual reference to Hamlet in this particular poem when Prufrock says that the reference to Hamlet is made, but interestingly the comparison is made only to negate it. So the speaker when the moment he mentions Hamlet, very quickly he says that I'm not Prince Hamlet, no was meant to be, and I'm going to read this stanza in a moment. But just before we do that, it's important to see how the intertextuality plays out in Prufrock. It's a comparison by contrast. So the comparison is made just to emphasize the contrast, just to underline the contrast, and that underlining the contrast becomes an important thing, right? So that's something which the male speaker does quite interestingly in this poem, right? So again, among other things, the reference to Hamlet is also a marker of high art, right? Like Michelangelo, right? So we just saw how Michelangelo becomes a metaphor for high art and its consumption, high culture and its consumption. So culture obviously over here becomes an activity of consumption, a process of consumption, right? And that's something which we need to keep in mind very, very consistently. The culture in Prufrock, culture in Eliot's early poetry, is always a process of consumption, a process through which certain artifacts are consumed, a process through which certain ideas are consumed, a process through which certain artworks are consumed, etc. Right? Now Hamlet again corroborates the consumption process. It continues that process of consumption. Now this is what the speaker says in terms of reference to Hamlet. And this is right after the speaker has made multiple references to the inability to tell what he actually means. And also he's foregrounded the fact that what he's saying is not exactly what he meant at all. So, right, that's not what I meant at all. That is not it at all. These are the lines with which the stanza ended, the stanza which we looked at the last lecture ended. Right. So again, the difference, the schism between meaning and narrating, the schism between what you mean and what you're able to narrate, that schism becomes quite dramatic in Prufrock, and that schism is epistemic. That schism is also existential, right? It becomes almost like an existential crisis, and this is something which we saw also in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, as I mentioned. There's a lot of references, there's a lot of connect that could be made between Prufrock and Heart of Darkness, because even there, as you know by now, we've just finished that text, Marlowe, when he comes back from Congo, is not able to convey what took place in Congo. It's not able to put that into a narrative which is solid and consistent and robust and which can be consumed consistently. And therein lies the slight absurdity, the danger of absurdity in Marlowe's narrative in Heart of Darkness. Okay, so with that narrative politics in mind, let's come to what this speaker is saying, and this should be on the screen, where he's saying, "No, I'm not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. I'm an attended lord, one that will do to swell a progress, start a scene or two. Advice a prince, no doubt, an easy tool, deferential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious and meticulous, full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse. At times, indeed, almost ridiculous, almost at times the fool." So the look at the bracket over here. It starts with Hamlet and ends with a fool, right? So Hamlet obviously is this melancholic, is an embodiment of melancholic masculinity, which has been glamorized in theatre. That image of this melancholic prince standing in the middle of the theatre and delivering very profound lines, that has always become a very glamorous, that has always carried a lot of glamour quotient in theatre, and the way theatre has been consumed and produced. Right? So Hamlet becomes a marker of the glamour, a marker of that glamorous masculine melancholia, which is princely, royal, profound, philosophical, etc. So the reference to Prince Hamlet is made, and again, the word prince is interesting because that's what has been conveyed to us, that this belongs to a higher pedestal of masculinity. This belongs to a higher pedestal of melancholia. So melancholia, or the self-absorbed man, is something which Hamlet represents or embodies in culture, in high culture. So the reference is made to Hamlet only to undercut it immediately, because the speaker is saying over here, "I'm not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. I was never meant to be a prince." And then, of course, we have a series of adjectives, series of epithets, series of descriptions about what he actually is. So what is he? He is an attended lord. So I'm very much a secondary person. I'm very much a second fiddle. I'm very much a person who is not really, who's not equipped to be in the foreground, who's not equipped to be the center of attention. One that will do to swell a progress, start a scene or two. So I can at best start a scene or two. I can at best swell a progress. I can advise a prince, no doubt an easier tool, right? So I can advise a prince. So my job, my position, my location over here is primarily that of an advisor. I'm someone who's a second fiddle. I'm someone who's in the background. I can always blend in the background, but I can never be the Prince Hamlet. I can never be the center stage of attention, because if I were that, then I could have easily have access or have had access to that room where women come and go talking of Michelangelo. The fact that I cannot go there, it means that I'm someone who's always relegated to the background. That relegation is also part of the existential alienation that the speaker says over here, the speaker experiences over here. So that experiential and existential alienation of the speaker is something which is constantly foregrounded, and and that becomes part of the self-effacing maneuver over here. So he's obviously being very, very self-efficacious, and he's effacing himself completely. He's not saying that I'm a big prince. In fact, he's just cutting himself down. He's just making his alienation more and more prominent, right? So he says that, and I'm deferential, I'm glad to be of use. So I'm a very usable person, but then I'm also very deferential, I'm very respectful. I'm not someone who is haughty or arrogant or pompous or proud. I'm definitely not someone who is in the center of attention. I don't belong there, right? So I'm someone who is just a second fiddle. I'm an attended lord, one that can start a scene, swell a progress, advise a prince, but that's about it. Deferential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious and meticulous. I'm politically correct. I am parliamentary, I'm cautious, I'm guarded, I'm very meticulous, I'm also very, I pay attention to details, full of high sentence. I can be pompous, but a bit obtuse. I can also be obtuse. I can also be, esoteric and pompous in a very negative way. At times, indeed, almost ridiculous. Almost at times, the fool. Now, this whole idea of this ridiculous and the fool is interesting because the fool in Shakespeare is a very complex character, as I'm sure most of you are aware of it. The fool is not really a jester in Shakespeare. The fool is also a philosopher in Shakespeare. But the only difference is, unlike Hamlet, who is also a philosopher, who is a philosopher prince, and that's how it's perceived and consumed in popular culture, the fool in Shakespeare is not taken seriously. It's not someone who's taken seriously. It's not someone who's paid attention to. But oftentimes you find it is a fool who has access to maximum information. It's a fool who has access to maximum insight, right? And this combination of insight and information that a fool has is often a very futile combination because it ends up being nothing. It ends up being just very meaningless and purposeless kind of a combination. So the fool over here becomes a metaphor of purposelessness. The fool over here becomes a metaphor of importance. As someone who is completely powerless, despite the prophetic quality that he or she may have. And this is what the state of Prufrock is. A Prufrock is at best a fool. Someone who probably knows things, someone who probably has a knowledge of reality, probably has a knowledge of what is the darkness around, what is the deception around, what is the pretense around, but then he cannot really bring himself to utter it or to articulate it or narrativize it, not least because he'll not be taken seriously, right? And the sort of lack of seriousness with which he is perceived, the lack of seriousness with which he has, which he's been received, is something which gnaws at his personality, something which cuts into his personality, something which alienates him further, right? And this alienation is interesting in terms of how this this whole narrative drama plays out. And this narrative drama is also psychological drama, as you know. It's something which he's experiencing. It's experiential, it's psychological, it's existential. But what it does essentially, in terms of all coming together, it alienates them. It alienates them socially, it alienates them psychologically, and it just makes them more and more self-effacing. So the self-effacement that we see over here is part of the alienation in a process. It's part of the process through which the speaker or the human subject gets more and more disconnected to the reality around them, right? So there's a lack of desire, there's a lack of connect, there's a lack of warmth, there's a lack of cognition, and all those lacks, all those crises, they combine together and inform the narrative crisis of the speaker, right? So again, like Heart of Darkness, we have the narrative crisis and a cognitive crisis coming together to generate a very unique and dark existential crisis, okay? And now we have this image of senility, which is depicted to us, an old age creeping in. I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. So again, the whole idea, look at the way in which something as profound and existential as senility is described with some sartorial markers, right? So the bottoms of trousers rolled becomes a marker of old age. So when an old age comes, you're not really a straight person, in straight in a sense, you're not really strong, you don't really have a very strong gait, you don't really have very strong features anymore, so you have to roll your trousers, right? So because you can't, you're always, bending down, you're not really straight and arrogant and pompous and strong anymore. So that, again, that becomes part of the the masculinity crisis in this particular poem. The fact that he has to roll the bottoms of his trousers now, has to sort of roll it down in order to fit in because his body is shrinking. And again, that could be connected to Shakespeare's 7 stages of man, and that stage where the human being, the human limbs, the human body begins to shrink because of old age. It's something which has been referred to over here. So I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. And then the speaker goes on to say, shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaid singing each to each, right? So again, the whole idea of rhetorical question, shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? And the peach is interesting over here because the peach is also reminiscent of the forbidden fruit, and there's if you take a look at different versions of the original scene story, you find there are certain versions which talk about the fruit as peach and not really apple, the way it is popularly perceived. that Adam and Eve, they ate an apple. But in certain versions, which are sometimes considered more authentic, the forbidden fruit is actually a peach. So do I dare to eat a peach? So that becomes as a marker of transgression. The peach over here becomes a marker of transgression. The speaker is asking himself, do I dare transgress? Do I dare be subversive? So shall I part my hair behind? So something very domestic and mundane, something related to appearance at a very mundane level. And immediately that is related to, that is equated with something almost cosmic in quality in terms of dimension. Do I dare to eat a peach? Do I dare to transgress? Do I dare to part my hair behind? And do I dare to transgress? They will put together in a very interesting, curious combination of opposites. And it also has a sort of a pathetic quality. And I talked about batters, I suppose, already. Batters has an anticlimactic thing. So we have a pitch towards which you're progressing, and suddenly there's a dip. And it falls into something which is flat and funny and flippant, and then it rises again into something which is profound and almost cosmic in quality. So there's no consistency in terms of significance. It just goes up and down, it dips up and down. And there's a reference to white flannel trousers. I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I've heard the mermaids singing each to each. So again, this whole idea of mermaids over here becomes interesting, because if you take a look at the poem at the end, it becomes increasingly a death song, a song of death, right? So it's like a death knell, right? So the mermaids are singing each to each, and this whole idea of the male speaker walking upon a beach wearing white flannel trousers, hearing mermaids, it becomes a very dreamlike, again, very cinematic sequence. So if you take a look at some of the expressionist cinema at that time, you find those films had scenes full of these types, where suddenly this dreamer, human subject, this dreaming human subject finds herself on a beach surrounded by fairies and mermaids, and sometimes people from real life, and then they find themselves rolling and sometimes flowing along the beach. So the beach, the sea, they become metaphors or instruments of endlessness, against which the limited human frame, the finite frame of the human body is situated in order to create a contrast. This limitlessness of the sea with the finitude of the human frame. So I've heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. So again, this is the death of desire that has been described over here. So I do not think the mermaids will ever sing to me, because I'm not desired as a person. And this inability to hear the mermaids singing to him, and this inability to believe that the mermaids can sing to him, but it becomes part of the death of desire process, or the thanatos process, if you will. So if you take a look at this, two very broad divisions, eros and thanatos, eros being life, sexuality, productivity, fertility, and thanatos being just the opposite, death, lack of productivity, lack of sexuality, lack of fertility. So the speaker over here is moving more and more towards the thanatos zone. In other words, this poem now begins to become a death poem. So it's not really a love song, it's a poem about lovelessness, right? So the lovelessness becomes foregrounded over and over again as a dramatic category, as an experiential category. So the speaker becomes acutely aware of the lovelessness that he's experiencing over here. So that's why the line, I do not think that they will sing to me. So again, it's the whole idea of existential alienation, the fact that he's cut off from all desire, all attention, from all human warmth. That becomes part of the existential problem that he's experiencing over here. I've seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back, when the wind blows the water white and black. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea, by seagulls writ with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us and we drown. So again, this whole idea of a dream sequence being interrupted, being cut by human voices. And interestingly, see how waking up is also an act of drowning, because prior to that, we have the whole idea of the dream elevating you, right? So riding seaward on the waves, and then the whole idea of the human subject lingering in the chambers of the sea. And if you go back at the beginning of the poem, where the image of the sea animal, I should be in a pair of ragged claws scuttling over the floors of silent seas. So again, the floors of silent seas, the chambers of the sea, they all come back over here. So all these different fluid images, they have sometimes an amniotic quality in which it can contain the human subject. So it's almost like a womb-like quality in which the human subject seeks solace, the human subject seeks situatedness or seeks comfort, right? So the chambers of the sea becomes over here an amniotic space where the human subject desires comfort. comfort. The human subject desires protection, right? But that is denied to him very, very quickly. Because human voices wake him up, and as soon as he wakes up, he drowns. So until human voices wake us and we drown. So we have lingered in the chambers of the sea by seagulls writ with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us and we drown. So rather, it's this whole idea of waking up and then drowning, the drowning becoming an image of helpless sinking or passive surrender, becomes interesting over here, because while the fluidity of the sea is amniotic, while the dreams or sequence of mermaids singing each to each becomes liberating, human voices waking up can only entail drowning. Now what that does, and this is going back to something we discussed already, human voices wake you up into clock time, right? So this becomes a departure from real time or psychological time. So if you remember, I mentioned Henri Bergson, H-E-N-R-I, Henri Bergson, B-E-R-G-S-O-N. And Henri Bergson had two dimensions of time that he theorized. One is clock time and one is psychological time, or clock time or real time. So real time or psychological time is the time that we situate, in which we are situated as human subjects, as feeling human subjects, right? And that the whole idea of inhabiting a time in which you can feel and experience gives you a sense of agency, right? So that becomes a unique time, that becomes a time that is uniquely available to you, and hence is psychological time, hence is real time, according to Bergson. Now if you contrast that to clock time is standard, clock time is standardized, clock time is uniform, clock time is democratic, clock time is equally accessible by everyone. So clock time doesn't make a difference in terms of the phenomenal feeling of the human subject. So the only way in which you can convert a feeling into time is by inhabiting real time or psychological time. Now this bit at the end where the human subject is saying, till human voices wake us and we drown. So when you wake up, we cut back into clock time. When we wake up, we cease to be in real time or psychological time, because then we wake up in a world where everything is the same, where everything is uniform, where everything is standard, and this whole idea of standardization and uniformity, it undercuts any idea of clock, of any idea of real time, any idea of psychological time, which can be liberating and elevating. So at the end of the poem, we find this is actually about time. This is actually about procrastination. This is actually about spatialization of time, where time becomes space, and in the process, the desire to inhabit that space-time, the desire to inhabit that time, so desire to move into time, right? And of course, the whole idea of the crisis over here is a crisis which comes when we get more and more alienated from time. So that space where women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. Again, look at the spatio-temporal quality. The women are coming and going, which is so spatial as well as temporal. They're coming and going at certain times, which is periodic in quality, that movement. And the speaker wants to have access to that space-time. So that spatio-temporality becomes a very interesting phenomena in Eliot's early poetry, especially in this particular poem, right? And so the last image is important. Human voices waking us, the human subjects are waking up by human voices, and then you wake up into reality. You wake up into standardized routine existence, or routine rituals, which are a very far remove, a very far departure from the elevation and the romance of psychological time and real time. The speaker had briefly experienced and enjoyed in his dreamlike sequence with the mermaids, right? So with that, we come to the end of the poem. So it is, among other things, a poem about time, a poem about procrastination, a poem about exhaustion, a poem about melancholia, and it's also a poem about culture and its consumption, right? So how culture is unequally consumed, right? So culture becomes an act of consumption, fair enough, but then the act of consumption is very unequal in quality. There are privileged consumptions, the privileged markers of consumption, and equally there's also inadequate consumption, or markers of inadequate consumption. And obviously the speaker in this particular poem, J. Alfred Prufrock, he becomes an embodiment of inadequate consumption. He in a way gets consumed because of his inadequate consumption. So he's being looked at, he's been gazed at. So if you take a look, if you remember some of the old lines which we read with some details, how certain parts of the body, certain parts of the dresses are sort of scrutinized and zoomed in using almost a magnifying glass. And this magnification is a very cinematic process where a certain object is magnified, where a certain object is sort of blown out of proportion just to convey a particular image, just to convey a particular point. And you find how the necktie, the hairbrush bag, the trousers rolled, so all these different sartorial and bodily markers, they actually they're reflective of the speaker's embodiment, or rather the crisis in embodiment. And as you remember, embodiment is an entanglement of the neural and the discursive negotiations that a human subject makes with the world around him or her. Right, so the neural and the discursive. So it is psychological, it is embedded, but equally it is extended. Right, so this embedded, extended quality of embodiment becomes a very important quality. And we find over here the speaker is trying to corroborate this lack of embodiment by looking at how the embedded as well as the extended qualities are compromised. So the embedded quality is compromised because he's psychologically confused, he's procrastinating all the time, he doesn't quite know how to convert an experience into a language, understandable language, and there's also a problem with extended embodiment because he cannot inhabit the space, the privileged space where women come and go talking in Michelangelo, the space of high culture, the space of privilege. Right, so these are some of the salient and fundamental points that this particular poem looks at in great detail. So as you know by now, as you agree by now, hopefully, this is one of the most important pieces of literature written in modernist periods because it ticks all the modernist boxes as we read it today. It has stream of consciousness, it has clock time and psychological time, it has neurosis. Modernism is also often about neurosis. It also has moments of epiphany where you have this light bulb moment where you realize something, which you remember something, and that elevates you and liberates you as a superior human being, right? So that those epiphanic moments are also there in this particular poem, although it all ends in futility and purposelessness. And the last image of the human subjects drowning in a sea of voices is interesting because, and again, if you take a look at it more literally, this human voices which are waking them up are standardized voices, and they drown their voices. They drown their unique subjectivity, they drown their unique agency. And this drowning of the agency is important over here, and that is something which the speaker is fearing. That's one of the threats of modernism, the complete annihilation of agency, the drowning of agency. The fact that the human body, the human subject, the human mind, the human feeling frame, they're all drowned by different instruments of standardization, by different instruments of utility, and by different instruments of uniformity. So uniformity and utility, those become the biggest torch bearers of modernist achievements of modernity, the achievements of modernity, against which we have the human subject, which is ambivalence, which is procrastination, which is melancholia, who is trying to insufficiently situate himself in that uniform, standardized space. And so the whole poem is about the failure to situate yourself spatio-temporally. So, situating yourself, it entails a spatio-temporal situation. It has to be in a particular space, it has to be in a particular time, and it has to be a combination of space and time. And that combination, that combined quality of spatial and temporality is something which the speaker can never inhabit fully or adequately. And that's what the poem is all about. It's about inadequate embodiment. And that accounts for procrastination, that accounts for indecision, that accounts for the narrative crisis, and that accounts also for the cognitive crisis. So these are some of the issues which we'll take up when we read the next poem that we will study in this particular course, which is also from Eliot's Prufrock and other observation, but that would be a poem called Preludes. But with this we come to an end of the love song on J. Alfred Prufrock. We'll move on to Preludes for the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.